afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Professor Freedman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to talk about gender violence and civil conflicts, and I'm going to talk about more generally, but also with a specific focus on the DRC. And the general theme of the presentation, what I want to talk about, is the fact that there is at the moment there are a lot of international programs, there's a lot of money being spent on preventing or eliminating sexual and gender-based violence in conflict, but it doesn't seem to be doing very much. So kind of questioning why, we've got this international response, a lot of very high-profile things are going on. We have Angelina Jolie going around with William Hague, the ex-UK Foreign Minister, talking about this subject, but still the problem isn't really being resolved. So I wanted to look at that in a kind of general context and also in the specific context of the DRC. So sexual and gender-based violence is very much on the agenda at the moment. There's always been, and it's something which is reasonably recent, I wouldn't say completely recent, but sexual violence has always existed in wars and conflict, but for a long time it was made invisible, people didn't talk about it, and it was something which was just not remarked upon, or people just thought, well, okay, that's something which happens in conflict, and it's just normal part of conflict. So it really became, it was put on the agenda by a lot of feminist lobbying, and feminist transnational networks really emerged around this area, and it was one area which, when there are differences in feminist groups between the global north and the global south, and there were lots of issues which they couldn't agree on, and one issue which was a kind of uniting issue for many feminist groups was this issue of violence against women, or gender-based violence. So, and especially around the whole, the questions of the Rwandan genocide and the use of sexual violence during the Rwandan genocide, and then the wars in the ex-Yugoslavia, which really put these issues, and with a lot of feminist lobbying, but really put the issues onto the international agenda. And as one of the leading, feminist scholars at the time said, the rape of women in Bosnia seemed somehow unique, and people were shocked because people hadn't talked about rape and they hadn't talked about sexual violence anymore. So when it happened in Bosnia, and it happened in Europe as well, so the Europeans couldn't say, okay, this is something which is happening in these faraway countries with people that are not so civilized as us. It was happening in Europe, and it really made put the issue onto the agenda. And there was a huge push for an integration of the question of gender and of gender-based violence, both in the legal framework for dealing with conflict, and in the tribunals of both for the ex-Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. It was recognised, rape was recognised as a crime by both of those tribunals, and it was a real push to put it into the own statute of the International Criminal Court. And then at the same time, in a kind of parallel movement, there was a big movement to integrate gender into the political military response to conflict and intervention through peacekeeping missions and through the UN. And in 2000 there was, again, following a lot of lobbying from women's groups and from feminist groups, the Security Council adopted this resolution 1325, which has now become quite well known, on women, peace and security. But it was a real milestone because that was the first time that gender or women had actually been discussed in the Security Council and being the object of a resolution. So there was a lot of movement both through the ICC and this legal process and through the UN, through the Security Council and kind of peacekeeping operations to talk about this issue. So just briefly to talk about the, I'm going to talk briefly about the ICC, and then I'm coming back to the kind of intervention through peace building and that kind of view international intervention. Briefly, I just wanted to talk about the ICC and the whole problem of the Rome Statute, because I think the way that gender was integrated into the Rome Statute actually shows some of the problems of how do we talk about gender and how can we integrate these questions into international law, into international policy. So gender was defined and included as a grounds for prosecution in the Rome Statute of the ICC, and it includes under the category of war crimes rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilisation, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. And there's also an article which prohibits discrimination based on gender in the interpretation and the application of the statute. So it was hailed as a massive victory by feminists and by feminist legal scholars, saying we've actually got the recognition of these as crimes and as war crimes. However, there was also debate, and there's also been criticism about the way gender is understood within the Rome Statute, and also about the way that it's been employed, or the way that it hasn't been employed. So, while in the negotiations for the Rome Statute, there was a lot of strong opposition to the inclusion of gender, which came from a kind of alliance of Muslim countries, but also Christian countries. I mean, it was a lot based on the fact that people didn't want to include gender because there was a worry about the confusion of talking about gender and then granting rights based on sexual orientation. So if we include gender, then we're going to talk about crimes and violence which is against homosexuals and based on sexual orientation. So there was a lot of opposition, and there was a lot of opposition because how can we talk about gender? Some people didn't want to talk about gender; they just wanted to talk about women for this reason. So it's more acceptable, or more easily acceptable, to talk about violence against women rather than gendered violence for that reason. And also there were criticisms about the lobby that were working to include gender, that it's very much a form of state feminism, so that the people who were working this way were not using the full critical power of gender, and that they were very much within the institutions of legal institutions, and it wasn't critical, and it wasn't transformative enough the way that the gender was used. So the final wording is, for the purposes of this statute, it's understood that the term gender refers to two sexes, male and female, which is coming back very much to a kind of binary definition of gender as based on biological sex, which for some feminists and for a lot of people it's not really a critical use of the term gender. And there's a question of whether this definition takes away the critical power of the inclusion of gender and just kind of reifies this dichotomy of male and female, and a return to some kind of form of essentialism. And also the fact that there's no definition of sexuality, sexual orientation. So, is this really as radical as some people said it was? The people, the feminists who are arguing for the inclusion and saying, well, it's good, well, it is good. And they said, well, the fact that it's in there, now we can use this kind of constructive ambiguity actually in the interpretation and the application of international criminal law to pursue these kind of prosecutions. But what's happened, and I think I'm coming now, to give an example from the DRC, what's happened is the fact that actually we've seen in the way that it has been used, that because of the kind of ambiguity of the way gender was used in the definition of gender, and also because of kind of institutional difficulties. There are a lot of we don't have the time here, but there are huge difficulties with the whole ICC process. and it's been criticised from a lot of, obviously you in the US know that there are lots of difficulties with the ICC, but there are lots of criticism of the ICC from many other sources. So the whole process and in the institutional way that gender, there's been barriers to the inclusion of gender and to prosecutions. And these really are shown in the example of one of the first prosecutions of the ICC, which was a case from the DRC, which I'm going to come back and talk more about the DRC, but one of the first cases, and a very high-profile case, was against Thomas Lubanga, who was indicted for crimes relating to the conflict in the DRC. And Lubanga was known Lubanga and his militia and his group were known to have committed lots of crimes of sexual violence, amongst all the other crimes that they committed, rape and sexual violence. But the terms of the prosecution, the indictment, they only indicted him for charges in relation to conscription of child soldiers. So the whole issue of rape and of sexual violence was left out of the indictment because it was seen that the prosecutor and the office of the prosecutor found that it was really too complicated to include those charges, and they were worried that if they tried to include those charges it would kind of derail the whole process. They wouldn't get proper witnesses, that it would be too difficult to get witnesses to come and testify. It would lengthen the trial too much. So despite the fact that there was really strong evidence of gender violence, and in fact at one point they suspended the trial to try and get extra evidence, and to try and add extra charges to the indictment, it never happened. So this is one case where the DRC has been held up, and I'm going to come back to this, but held up as a kind of a bad example of a conflict where gender violence, where sexual violence is evident. There's high levels of sexual violence, but in this the first big prosecution from the DRC, it was totally left out of the prosecution, which for many people and people in the DRC, where there was like women who've been campaigning on this issue, were very disappointed that it took away some kind of legitimacy from the trial, and also from their struggles to have the kinds of violence that had been going on recognised through the process. So, there was a dissenting opinion too, which said that there was no account of the discriminatory, even within the question of child soldiers, there was no account of the discriminatory violence between girls and boys. And that wasn't even, so there was one dissenting opinion on this. But the whole process was perhaps seen as a missed opportunity for when, the international legal system could have done something to bring, and one of the problems in DRC, which people are constantly coming back to within the national legal system, is the problem of impunity, and that they just don't convict people for these kind of crimes of sexual and gender-based violence. So beyond this one trial, there was the hope that it would have a trickle-down effect onto the national judicial system, which hasn't really happened at all. So we can see some kind of failure in this legal approach to fighting against sexual and gender-based violence. I want to move quite quickly, but if you have any questions afterwards, obviously I can come back to things, to talk about how gender violence has been, taken up within the whole peacekeeping, conflict resolution side of things. So I made reference before to you the Security Council Resolution 1325, which was seen as a major milestone, because we're going to talk about women, peace and security. And following 1325, there's been a whole, I think 9 now Security Council resolutions which deal with the issues of gender in conflict, gender violence. There are specific resolutions on gender violence in conflict. So there's a whole movement within the Security Council to pass these resolutions. There's been a movement to do gender mainstreaming in peacekeeping operations. and the UN Peacekeeping Organization has, so there's a big movement, like we need to put gender on the agenda, we need to think about gender in conflict resolution and in peacekeeping, and part of this is preventing sexual violence. And then the UK government launched in 2013 a very high profile Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative, which was launched by William Hague, the UK Foreign Minister, and they put a lot of money into, and they tried to put a lot of money into all of these programs to prevent sexual violence in conflict. But I would argue again that the impact of all this has been very limited. Why has what problems are, why has the impact been so limited? Again, there are problems of definition. So what do we mean by gender-based violence? We talk about sexual and gender-based violence. What is gender? Which is always problematic. Some people have just, gone back to this, gender is violence against women. But then there's a problem. If we say gender is violence against women, we're overlooking the fact that that there is sexual violence in conflict and gender-based violence against men and boys as well. So we can't just ignore the fact that men and boys are also victims of violence. So gender violence isn't violence against women. And then some people are saying, how far do we widen the definition? Is all violence gendered? And if we come back to the original push for talking about gender violence, rather than just talking about violence against women, the idea was to link these individual acts to kind of wider social constructions and wider social and economic inequalities. But somehow, in the way that gender is being used, there's criticisms that it's kind of being depoliticized. Depoliticized because we're not actually talking, when people are doing programs or intervening on sexual and gender-based violence, they're not really talking about gender. They're not really talking about these social constructions. They're just talking about, okay, this is sexual violence, this is gender, this is, but without actually thinking about what gender is, and what about thinking about, what about men? We have to talk about men. Men are victims too, but just kind of adding men, and when people started saying, men are victims too, so we can't just talk about violence against women, but we can't just also add men and stir it up and say, okay, now we're talking about gender because we're including men as well. And a lot of the debate has been about, how do we talk about masculinities? How do we talk, because masculinities, men can be victims, but we can also talk about masculinities as part of the problem, and all these talk about hegemonic masculinities and how that can be a cause of gender violence. And there's a real need, which doesn't happen very often, I'm afraid, in these programs, a real need to think and understand. Masculinities is not just about male bodies, it's not just about men. We need to link it to again, back to these gendered structures of power, and understand the gendering of both men and women in relations of violence. So when we come to conflict, we have this problem with, what is gender, what's gender violence? And in conflict, there's also all these problems about how do we explain the particular, use of gender violence in conflict. There's a problem of very essentializing explanations which are still there and still exist. So explanations which say, okay, it's just opportunism. As soon as there's which will come back to this argument a bit that like all men are potential rapists, which came from some feminists in the 1970s. But as soon as there's a war, all social limits and disappear. So there'll be all this opportunist violence, which is very essentializing, or this violence has become somehow a natural byproduct of war. There are also people who explain, like in the DRC, people say, men have certain needs, again, an essentializing biological explanation. So people were saying, the men in the Forces Armées de la République démocratique du Congo, the official Congolese army, they don't get paid very often. People in Congolese, in lots of places, don't get paid. So they weren't getting paid, they didn't have any money, they were far away from their wives. So people were saying, they don't have any money, they can't go to prostitutes, what do you expect these men to do? And then, there's still this explanation, okay, this is what happens. There's also explanations about male socialization, hegemonic masculinities, the fact that, using sexual violence was a way of showing that you could belong to and somehow a rite of initiation into an armed group and into an army, and there's lots of work about socialization in armed groups through this production of hegemonic masculinity. There's in the DRC too, which is very relevant, the whole problem of resource grabbing and the fact that people were using rape, sexual violence as a way to gain territory, to gain resources. But then you have the question, well, why would you use sexual violence? Why sexual violence? Why is that used more than any other type of violence if you want to, get the mines or get land? And there's also the link which comes in between gender and ethnic and national divisions, which we can see, using sexual violence to assert the dominance of one ethnic group. That was very clear in the Yugoslavian civil war, when there was sometimes specific strategies of trying to impregnate certain women to have babies, so that this idea of the reproduction of a nation, which also comes into it. So there are all these different explanations, some of which are kind of essentialist and which we'd like to reject, but there are all these different explanations, and we need to really, I think, understand the complexity of sexual and gender-based violence, and also the continuum between sexual and gender-based violence in conflict and other types of gender violence which are happening, domestic violence, which are happening regularly. And too often there's this kind of division. So we're going to say, okay, so the initiative that William Hague started, the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative, they said we're going to work in sexual violence in conflict. This is worse than other types of gender violence. We can't talk about domestic violence and conflict-related violence in the same ways or using the same tools. And I think that's a mistake, and I think that's one of the problems with a lot of these approaches, that they divorce this, they make it special, and they make this kind of violence divorced from other kinds of violence, which takes away the understanding of it being anchored within unequal relations of power and unequal social relations, and these gendered social constructions which are present at all times in society. So I'm just going to quickly give the example of the DRC to try and illustrate some of this. The DRC has kind of, perhaps a good example, I don't know if a good example is the word, it's often been called, or sometimes been called, the worst place in the world for women, or the rape capital of the world, or there are lots of people who have written about the DRC and said, this is the worst place in the world because lots of women are being raped, there's lots of sexual violence in the conflict. There were estimates that in 2006, for example, 400,000 women were raped. There are lots of debates over the reliability of the statistics because, how do you get statistics? Sexual violence is always underreported because people don't want to talk about it. Obviously, it's very difficult to talk about. You often don't want to admit to it. It's very stigmatizing to talk about it. There are also actually, strangely, reasons for over-reporting, which is related to the whole funding structure and the way that there has been an enormous amount of money being poured into the country for projects relating to sexual violence, which has created this kind of market of NGOs who want to show how, and because of the way that NGOs are funded, by the way the international organisations themselves are funded now, they have to show, they have this results-based management. So results-based management means you need to show how many victims of sexual violence your programme has treated to get more funds. So there's, people say when you're there that actually there's also this kind of double counting because these organisations will go and try and find, women who've been raped, come here, we want you in our programme because we'll count you and we'll use it to get more money. Which sounds very cynical, but actually when you're there and you see the operation of NGOs, it's kind of how it works. Also in DRC, it's really important to see that there's high levels of sexual and gender violence, even where there's not conflict, even in the areas. Now there's more conflict starting again in Kinshasa, but there was a period where there were certain regions were relatively stable and there wasn't conflict, and there were still very high levels of sexual and gender-based violence, very high levels of domestic violence, in an increasing proportion committed by civilians. So we need to think about that, and we need to think about a lot of the programs that were targeting sexual violence were just targeting people who had been victims of rape by soldiers, and they weren't thinking about all these other forms of domestic violence, which is also very problematic in this country. So sexual violence it's no longer an invisible issue. People are talking about it. You know, people say DRC. You've probably seen newspaper reports, and people write articles about it, about how terrible it is, and all this sexual violence. And I don't want to say in any way that I don't think it's a good thing that people are talking about it and that it has come to international attention. But in some ways, the way that people are talking about it is also very problematic. We could say that perhaps there's been too much focus. Perhaps it's because it's a thing that, you can do a shock headline. I'm sorry to say it again, it probably sounds cynical, but you can do a shock headline in a newspaper about women being raped, and it's a way of drawing attention to the story. So perhaps we're, focusing too much on sexual violence. And there's concern, some people have said, there's this kind of sexual violence tourism where you get Angelina Jolie, you get other celebrities who are going to go and see this doctor in Bukavu who's, helping, he's become a, great, somehow heroic figure. But there's a lot of the reports also are very, kind of what we could call pornography of sexual violence, when people are reporting on this in a kind of very perhaps voyeuristic kind of way. There's a lot of use also of very stereotypical colonial imagery, where we're seeing these people as the DRC. This is a country where people are kind of savage, they're talking about the savagery and the violence in terms which have a very strong link to racist colonial imagery. For example, there was one report which talked about how dangerous, because they have in DRC, also in the Kivus, they have the gorillas, which also in Rwanda, in the place the border near Rwanda, they have lots of gorillas in the forest. And there was one article which compared the men fighting in the militias. They're as dangerous as the gorillas in the forest. So this kind of images which link men, Congolese men, this bestiality, they're savage, they're not civilized. So this way of reporting and talking about sexual violence, which dehistoricizes it and removes it from wider historical, socioeconomic or political contexts. So I just want to skip a bit because I want to finish, I don't want to talk for too long. So what are the international responses and what are the problems? So the MONUSCO, which is the UN peacekeeping force, has incorporated actions on prevention of sexual violence. They do training for peacekeepers too, but which is limited. And there's been a huge influx of funding for SGBV response, and particularly in the east of the country, in the Kivus, which are the regions where there has been a lot of reported violence. So, for example, the US donated over $50 million since 2010 for projects relating specifically to sexual violence. And there is a massive increase in the number of international organisations, NGOs, local NGOs. So in the North and South Kivu regions, there's probably at least 300 organisations which claim to be working on sexual violence. And often they're organisations, people have started their own NGOs a lot, or they were NGOs that were working on something completely different, and they suddenly say, oh yeah, we're going to work on sexual violence, because if you put, they see it as a way to get funding, which you can't criticise people in a country which is extremely poor and where people have, very few ways of making money. It's hard to criticise it when there's that much money coming in. It's kind of a normal strategy. So there's a creation of a market for SGBV services, which all these people are competing against each other. Even the different branches of the UN are competing against each other. So when I was there, I was with the UNDP, and they had a new report on sexual violence. So they said, okay, we're going to show it to you, but please don't share this with UNHCR, because we want our data for our project proposals. So you have a context where UNDP don't want to talk to UNHCR and they won't share their data. So, this is the kind of thing that's going on. And the Congolese talk about, when you talk to people, they say we just have this NGO disease, which is very visible, and you see all these people driving around in these great big white cars, which probably, they're so visible. But there is a huge amount of activity going on this sexual violence prevention thing. But there's a real lack from a lot of the international interventions. There's a real lack of knowledge as well of the staff who are doing it, because they bring in, this is our gender violence expert, and they bring them in, and the person who comes, okay, they may have done training courses on gender violence, they might have worked in lots of different, but then they come to DRC and they don't really understand the context of what's going on in the conflict there, and the conflict there is very, very complicated. I mean, it's based on lots. I'm not going to talk about all the different reasons why there's conflict in the DRC, but it's hugely complex and it changes all the time. Last time I was in Goma, somebody said there are about 50 armed groups, operating in this area at the moment, and it changes every time you go. There's different armed groups and they're different people, and it goes from village to village, and it's very complex. But the people who come to deal with sexual and gender-based violence, they don't have, they come in and they stay for because it's also it's called like hardship station or whatever. So the people who come internationally, they stay for a year or two and then they go and somebody else comes. So a lot of the responses also aren't really adapted. So what's wrong with these responses? First of all, to come back to something that kind of I mentioned before, there's a very narrow definition often of what sexual and gender-based violence is. They talk about it as rape and sexual violence, and rape of women. Again, even though people are saying, yeah, but we need to include men, there's really still very little going on for male victims of violence. And, I talked to the gender officer of the MONUSCO, for example, and they said, we know there's violence, other violence, but we are focusing on women who've been raped. And rape is our thing. So it's like, but they're seeing rape completely in isolation from all other forms of domestic violence, other forms of gender violence which are going on. And because of this, there's a real disconnect between gender violence and the other underlying gender inequalities. So people are not thinking about, well, women are completely underrepresented in politics. There's economic equality, land ownership, all of those issues which are very different. There's huge inequalities in all those areas, but they're talking about violence as something which is completely separate from all those other issues. And then there's also, as I've kind of mentioned, these perverse effects of programs where they're trying to, where somehow they create victims. Also, they create victims because people want to count the number of people they have coming to their service, but also because in a context of extreme poverty, the fact that people are coming and offering services for free to people who have been raped creates an incentive for people to say, yes, I have been raped. So there's one example. I talked to somebody from an NGO, an international NGO, who had just built a clinic near Goma. They built a clinic for women who had been raped. And they were surprised. She said, we were really surprised by the number of women who came. We knew that sexual violence and rape there was a lot of it, but we were shocked. And then you look at the context and you think, well, there's hardly any health service. For most women, there's no health service. They can't go and see a gynecologist. I mean, that just doesn't exist. They're extremely poor. So if there comes to be a service, a clinic, which is offering these kind of services, as long as you say you've been raped, well, obviously there's an incentive to say, yes, I've been raped. So it creates the whole way that this has been done without actually really thinking about the context of a very poor country. And there are other programs which say we're going to give reparations. So we'll give you some money if you say you've been raped. So it's very, it creates these perverse incentives to say, yes, I've been a victim. And also to reinforce the divide between women who are victims and the men who are perpetrators, and really not thinking about all of these things. And there's also something which people, which some people have mentioned, whereas the use of sexual violence becomes a bargaining tool for some of the armed groups. So they'll say, okay, we'll come to makes them important. If they say, yes, we're one of the groups that have committed all this violence, then it makes it more important for them to be included in the negotiations. So it kind of reinforces their position in, we've got to include that group in the negotiations because they're one of the worst people. So all of this means that there's lots of money, there are hundreds of programs, but things are not really changing that much. So just, I need to finish because I think I talked a bit too long, but how could it be more effective? I think we need to talk, it's just saying what I was kind of repeating, but really linking this whole idea of gender-based violence, underlying gender inequalities, talking about continuums of violence, and really contextualizing, making things more relevant, and understanding cultures, local cultures and difference, and as heterogeneous and changing, and also talking to the women themselves locally about, what's the problem, what do you need, and, if you say to the women, what do you want, what would you like us to do, they would say, land reform actually is probably something which would be more important for them. So I'll stop there, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to ask to reply. Yeah.
My name is Ben. What or where is DRC?
What or when? I'm sorry.
DRC,
Dominican Republic of Congo.
Democratic Republic.
Oh, sorry.
Democratic Republic of Congo. It's that country. Sorry, I should have brought a map. It's that big country right in the middle of Africa. It was a Belgian colony for a long time, and so there are two Congos. There's the Republic of Congo, which is a small country which is more near the west coast, and the Democratic Republic is right in the middle, and it borders with lots of Uganda and Burundi and Rwanda, and then it comes around the borders with, it's huge. Zambia at the bottom. It's a country which has a very kind of difficult history. It's a massive country. I think it's the second biggest country in Africa after Nigeria. It was colonized by the Belgians because they had rubber, and they have a lot of minerals. But the Belgian colonization was very violent. It was the King of Belgium actually. It was a kind of colony where it was the King of Belgium who owned the Congo as a personal property. And you might have seen like the films where they chop people's hands off, and they also have huge mineral resources. So they have all of these international, multinational mining companies that are there. They have the coltan for phones, they have diamonds, but it's incredibly poor. And then after the Belgians, they had Mobutu, who was a dictator for a very long time. And after he was deposed, they've had their current leader, Kabila, also for a very long while. Kabila, his father, now the son, Kabila, who's the president, who won't go. They've been trying to hold elections there for about 3 years, and they've got one of these leaders who... So it's very corrupt, it's very poor, and they've been in various conflicts for a very long time, like decolonial conflicts, but then also civil war for a very long time. Sorry, that was a very quick summary of the Congo, but DRC.
Part of the question was
sorry.
Are there any hopes or solutions to stop this rape or sexual harassment or whatever, in your opinion?
I think, my opinion would be that, obviously we need to stop it, and one of the ways of stopping it would be to try and reduce the conflict there, but it's very, very complex. What I would argue for is that, we do need to address this and have programs, but they need to be much more at a local and national level and much more adapted to, what is going on in the local context, and not even because it's a huge country, and the Kinshasa, which is the capital, is very different from what's going on in the east, in Kivu. So you need very low, and I think this is true for all countries where these, I'm using the Congo as an example, but the DRC is an example, but in all of those contexts, to have a very much more local understanding. It's a problem of international intervention, not just on gender, I think, more generally, that often misses this kind of local understanding, and people are just, the UN I don't want to be too critical of the UN, but the UN are just going in with like one size fits all. We have our gender program, we're going to just throw it in wherever.
So I was just wondering if there are some consequences to throwing men in with women's violence, just because I kind of feel like, it does happen, but men are generally the perpetrators. And then also, I guess I'm not familiar with any cases where men are raped in war. So I'm just wondering, are we disenfranchising women by trying to lump them in with male violence, like sexual violence?
Well, this is one of the problems, like how to include men and how to talk about men. You
Do we
said
need to include men?
we do need to include men because you said, the fact that you said you don't know of any cases where men have been victims of sexual violence shows that actually, and it's not a criticism of you, because I think lots of people would say the same thing. Whereas men, if you actually research more, men are also victims of sexual violence in conflict. And it's used for, perhaps different reasons, but it's a way of, if we think about the constructions of masculinities, it's a way of some men, proving their superiority over other men. Using sexual violence against men is it's very humiliating for men. It's a way of humiliating them and saying, you're not a real man, and we're going to treat you like a woman in some, if we can kind of make it in very simplistic terms. And it does happen, and there is a lot of sexual violence, and it's not talked about. But the problem is, how, if we say we're going to talk about gender violence, okay, everyone can be a victim of gender violence, then does it become, this too general
Right, because I
thing?
do wonder, like, you have the one narrative where it's, the power struggle between, the men and the women in conflict, but then you also mentioned the already existing inequalities that kind of stems from. So is there a way to kind of separate, like...
Well, I think we really need to think about the way that men and women become gendered, and how in different contexts, what is masculinity and femininity, and how social inequalities, economic, how all of this is constructed, and how that plays out in a conflict situation, which will differ from one situation to another, which can also explain to us why men will be victims, because men will be victims when there are these hierarchies. All masculinity isn't the same. There are hierarchies where the dominant forms of masculinity are have certain values, and that also it's linked to it could be linked to ethnic division. So you can use it to show our ethnic group is superior to yours, and we're going to use sexual violence against men to humiliate these men and show that these men from this other group are like women. That we're humiliating them and using. You can see, in another context in Iraq, the fact that sexual violence and sexual torture was used against Iraqi men who had been in prison or something. That was clearly a way of in a national context. So gender is something which interacts with ethnic or national or religious divisions to produce these forms of social hierarchy and power. And then in the context of conflict, that gets played out in different forms of violence, which is why we need to analyse in different circumstances. And I don't think there's it's simple, like we need to include men in this way or that way. I think you need to again to think about the context and what's happening. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, I guess on the one hand, funding for prevention, but also just attention and support from either the UN or NGOs, and the relationship of that attention and funding to whether or not one or more of the world powers, we could just sort of call them that, whether they be political or economic powers, whether or not they are directly or maybe one layer removed from a particular conflict, or whether their participation is more obscure.
I think it's definitely linked to who has an interest and how people have an interest in the conflicts in different world powers. The DRC, in the DRC example, it's clearly linked to economic interests, and the fact that there's so much economic interest in the country because of the economic resources, and also because it's seen somehow as it destabilises, and it's a regional conflict too. It's not just a country conflict, but it's been and a post-colonial Cold War. There's the whole history of its situation in terms of the post-colonial Cold War kind of setting. So I think in that way, that that's why it's become, there's been a lot of attention being paid to the country because it's economically hugely important and strategically. And, and it's not just about the funding for gender violence, it's about the way that people have, supported Kabila when, and because they think he's some kind of stability. They said, we're going to do peacekeeping, we're going to have elections, and we're going to produce Kabila as the president because he's the best president for us. But I think you can see it in lots of other conflicts too, the attention that's paid to, we're going to do funding here because we need this country, it's important for us, or, we want to be rival. In DRC, like in lots of other African contexts, there's the problem with China too, whereas people are worried about China coming in, and China is coming in massively and funding a lot of things. So clearly the geopolitical impact or interest in that, which, in Myanmar, in the Rohingya, there's been a huge amount of sexual violence, and I don't think there's so much attention or, being money or resources being pushed into that being given to that, because that perhaps is not such a strategically important context or conflict. So yeah, definitely.
A quick question. One of the many tragedies of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, is the mineral resources you referred to. So the diamonds, I think I read somewhere that if the diamonds were properly utilised the way, say, South Africa or other countries are doing, it'd be one of the richest countries in the world by a long way. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, this is several causal things I'm thinking about here, the role of conflict diamonds when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence, but also, Congo, it's this enormous country, but everyone's spread around the borders in many ways. There's this large dispersed population, but there's also all these other groups around. We know the way that colonial powers divided up Africa, and I'm wondering what the role of kind of interethnic violence plays into all of this, along with all that money, and along with this sort of, it's a complex set of issues, but the NGOization of the country, where in some ways sovereignty gets taken away from Congo through the influence of NGOs. I'm wondering how this all plays together to create this nightmarish situation. I'm sorry, that's a lot.
Yeah, but it's true. The problem is that the context, the political context, and the context of the conflict is so multifaceted that it's, and it's all linked. So it is incredibly rich because they have made, the mineral resources, not just diamonds, but also the coltan things they use for phones, and it could be incredibly rich, but the mining is controlled by, the government sells the mining rights or gives the mining rights to companies, multinational companies, or and it creates a huge amount of violence because they all have their little militia that come and protect the mines, who are also responsible for committing violence against they push local populations, and a lot of the mining areas are very, very remote. The country is, as you said, it's huge, and it's very hard to travel from, travelling around. There aren't proper roads, there's no proper infrastructure, you can't really get anywhere. You can get anywhere, but it's, a lot of the villages where the miners are remote. You can, would take you 4 days to walk to the next village, or you go on a motorbike, or the NGOs come in helicopters. But these people are very remote, so they're very vulnerable. And once the mining company comes with their, and they pay, private security or local people they recruit to do security, that's also a source of incredible violence. But it's not addressed because they don't. The government profits a lot, and there's a lot of corruption, and people say that's one of the reasons Kabila won't go, because he's got too many economic interests. He wants to stay. Also, other economic, other countries have an interest because it's their their companies who are profiting from that. So it's a huge. And there are lots of research about the link between the minerals and the violence. It's also, people say, the Congolese say that's why Rwanda wants to take the east of the country, because Rwanda is interested, but Rwanda and Congo have, a long history since Mobutu, and, it's been a very long, and it's very, very divisive. So it's not just a national conflict, it's, in that sense, it's a regional conflict. And the interethnic thing, I think sometimes it's overplayed, because also it's another, kind of somehow colonial stereotype, these ethnic groups fighting with each other, and it's easy to say, yeah, it's an ethnic conflict. There are some points, like in the East, there's a lot of resentment against the Rwandese. There were lots of Rwandans who came after, in the 90s, and there's a lot of resentment because some people say the Rwandans bought, they imported this kind of sexual violence because they imported it from Rwanda. So now there's a lot of, there is a feeling and a linguistic difference, because you can tell, like, the Rwandans who speak Kinyarwanda and the other people, the local people who speak Kiswahili, and so there's conflict there. And there's also conflicts on a really local level, like land conflicts, which again comes from Belgium and the way that Belgium imposed their rule and how they gave out land to different people. And so it can be very localized into just, land conflicts in certain areas. So there are so many different layers, which makes it very hard to find a solution for the conflict. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but over here, sorry, yeah.
So I have kind of more of an abstract question in the sense that what do you believe is the role academics should or should not play in policy formation? And that do we really know enough about any topic that's in the social sciences that we can prescribe policy to policymakers, and that we can provide answers to questions such as these?
Well, I think academics, our role should be to do research, to try and find out what is, what we think and how we can understand certain things. So I think, I don't think we can prescribe questions. I mean, I don't say I have the response to, how to tackle sexual and gender-based violence, but what I think was when I was in, when I spent time in the DRC, my interest was to try and research. I do ethnographic research, so I did a lot of interviews and talking to people about how they understood gender, what their experiences are of gender relations, and to try and find out, and perhaps that research in a modest way could help people who wanted to, have a policy response to gender inequality, because if you're going to have a policy response, you actually need to understand what the problem is before you make a policy. So I think that's perhaps what the role of academics is, to try and, provide better understanding of what the problems are that the policy needs to address. But I wouldn't say that I could design an excellent policy on the basis of that. But hopefully I could.
Because you mentioned how, when they brought in, the sexual violence experts.
Yeah.
Well, to me, it makes sense that who better would that be than the
but it's not an academic. It's in the UN. It's people that the UN has a system where they have these experts who, they might have a master's or they might have done some studies on gender equality, but they're like international experts. So they come, and I think that's the problem. There are these people who I'm a gender equality expert internationally, but then you bring them into a certain country, and it might not be DRC, it could be Iraq, or it could be Afghanistan. How are they going to understand? Because gender is something which is, changes in all different countries. The gender inequalities, gender constructions change from one society to another. So how are those people who circulate, and they don't really stay very long in each country, but they come with this is our gender policy. So I think that's, they're experts in the sense of the UN says they're experts, whether they really are. They're experts in implying UN policies.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, did you? Don't know who was first. Okay, yeah.
Professor Jane, it's a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you very much.
And I had a question about when the international judicial community is reviewing a case of violence, what is considered to be valid evidence that the international codes were violated?
So that's a problem because, in the ICC they have people who, the prosecutor's office has teams that go and find evidence, but one of the things that they want to do for evidence is to bring witnesses, bring people who have, who can provide, in a court situation, describe, I've been victim of violence and I know this person did this, and it provokes problems because how. First of all, it's very traumatic for people who've been victims of that kind of violence to come and talk about it. So one of the arguments, like in the Lubanga case I was talking about, for not, not prosecuting for gender violence was like, well, that would be terrible for all these women to, bring them to The Hague and make them talk about, the fact that they've been raped. So that's a big problem for those kind of cases. And then, how there's a question of whether there are perhaps, we didn't talk about it, are there alternative forms of justice or, legal procedures that could not involve people having to come and give evidence as witnesses that this happened to me, and that's it's a good question.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay, one more question.
So in terms of shaping this kind of narrative of the war in the Congo as war on women, what role do you see of the interests of Kabila and then the neighboring countries, Rwanda and Uganda, that have been involved in how much of creating this narrative comes from them and how much of it comes from other kinds of sources?
So the Kabila's government, they acknowledge and they say, yes, we have this problem, and they have a national strategy on gender violence, and it's in their interest because they also get money from the UN, who will send somebody and send lots of people to, come to Kinshasa and let's have this great big expert meeting on gender violence. We'll help you write your national strategy, and we'll give you funding and we'll give you money if you produce a national strategy. So to some level, that it's in their interests to say, we have a problem and we're doing something about it, as long as they're not implicated, as long as they're not implicated themselves, and as long as they can come out of it showing our government has a strategy, they have a national action plan for UN SCR 1325. They have all these strategies, and the strategies which were written and with the help of the international community, so with money and so it does have some advantage for them. But on the other hand, they don't want to be, they don't like being stigmatized as being, the worst country in the world for women, or so it's a kind of double-edged sword. So in some ways they feed the narrative because they say, yes, we have a problem, come and help us and give us money to tackle this problem. On the other hand, it's also stigmatizing for a country to be labelled in that way, so it doesn't help them so much. They also use the strategy of saying, like the whole thing about Rwandans, and it's Rwandans who brought this strategy to us. Clearly that's the, DRC's tactic, saying it's not us, it's not our problem, it's the Rwandans who are importing it. Or, when the Ugandans come across the border, and they always, it's clearly, an issue of who can they blame as well, which it's kind of quite easy to blame Rwanda or blame Uganda or blame someone else for your problems as well. So,
I'm afraid we are out of time. Before we thank our visitor, I'd like to remind you that Professor Freedman will be talking on the global flow of refugees, the global crisis, about tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. in the Cub Senior Ballroom. I'd also like to remind you that there's more information about Professor Freedman's books just outside on the table, outside the Foley Institute. But now could you join me in thanking Professor Freedman for a fantastic